All right, video number 3 in this series. This one is about the National Registry exam itself. It promotes anxiety walking in the door, and that can be a hindrance for some people. The more you prepare and the more you understand the exam, the better you'll do. I'm Dan Limmer from Limmer Education. Let's talk about the exam itself. The EMT and the paramedic exam are adaptive. There's no set number of questions. EMT, you'll get a minimum of 70, and 60 of those count, 10 are pilot questions. For paramedic, you'll get a minimum of 80, and 20 of those don't count, they're pilot questions. AEMT, still a set number, 135 questions, 35 of those don't count, they're pilot questions. So as we look at the exam itself and the length of the exam, I'm going to start with a tip early off. If you haven't sat down and taken a practice exam in its entirety, one sitting, you're doing yourself a disservice. You need to know what it's going to feel like to sit there for 45, 60, 75, 90 minutes, 2 hours as you take that test. You should know that feeling. Do that before you go in. Now, the exam is adaptive. What does that mean? It means it gives you questions that are increasingly more challenging. If you get a question right, it's going to say, okay, they got that. Let's give them a little bit more and a little bit more. That does a couple things. The first is to test your knowledge as you go along. You can get shut off at EMT at 70, paramedic at 80. And that can be either good or bad, right? Because you have to convince that exam by getting questions right that you know what you're doing. Never pay attention to that number, right? I know it's going to be hard too. If you get to 70 or 80 and it keeps going, you've got to stay out of your head for the exam. It's the best thing that you can do. That leads to the next tip. Answer every question as if it's a question alone. Do it to the best of your ability and then move on to the next question. Here's where people start to fail, where their head starts to go when they're taking the National Registry. You get a question. Maybe it's near the end of the exam and it's challenging, which is good, by the way. And you answer the question and you move on. You can't go back. But you're worrying about that question that went by. That distracts you from answering this question better. Once you move on, that question has to leave your head and you answer the next question to the best of your ability. And that is the best and the singularly, almost the only way to pass the National Registry is to answer every question to the best of your ability. There is no connection between the question you're answering now and a past question or the next question other than the right or wrong. Remember that in EMT, 10 questions don't count, paramedic 20. So let's say you get a whole bunch of questions on a pregnancy complication, on placenta previa. Maybe it's on tension pneumothorax. What a lot of people do is, am I getting these questions because I got other ones wrong? Maybe I should change my answer. No, never. Take each question, answer it to the best of your ability. You may think the question in front of you is the same question you got before, but a small subtlety in that question makes it different. And it could be a pilot question, right? So sit down, take a practice exam, take many practice exams, get used to the time frame. Answer each question to the best of your ability. And then finally, something I've mentioned here before, but I want to say again, is that if you're getting harder questions, that's a good thing. If you get to question 65 or 75, and you're like, what are they asking? This is really hard. I'm not even sure they taught this in class. This is a hard question. Instead of freaking out saying, gee, maybe it means I'm doing well. Because when you get those harder questions, right, there's a line. And the National Registry will give you questions below that line. And then you gradually move up. And if you stay above that line, this is that 950 line on the EMT test, right? If you stay above that, even by a little bit, and you get to that endpoint, you're going to pass. But the questions are going to get harder as you go along. So remember that hard questions aren't necessarily bad. They may actually mean you're doing well. Finally, no one gets 100 on the National Registry. You may be that student in class that had an A or an A+ average, right? But a lot of the tests that you got in class aren't going to be like the ones you saw in the National Registry, right? They're not going to be there. The big bone in the thigh is called D. You're not going to see it. However, as you go through and you do better and get used to these questions, you'll be okay. They're just not like your class questions. Nobody gets 100. They're going to give you harder and harder questions, and yes, you'll eventually get some wrong. What do you do if you think you got a question wrong? Let it go. Answer the next question to the best of your ability. You need to beat that exam by showing them what you know. There are no tricks. There are no tips. Anybody who says, oh, you should always choose airway, or you should always do this, or you should always, that's not the way it works. The registry questions are beautifully written that are going to require you to make a decision. And what do you need to do when you're an EMT on the street is make decisions. The exam is not evil. It's not different than the street. It's not different than your class. It's not different than the book. It just asks questions in a demanding way. Meet the demands and pass the test.